All right, we'll go ahead and get started, and we may have some others join us soon. We do have in the house the one, the only, the legend Pete Davis join us today, and we'll get right to him with an introduction here. But first, wanted to say I see a few new faces on today, and I know this is a different date than what we normally have the class, and so I did hear from several that couldn't be here today. Uh, but for those that are new to the group, welcome. Glad to have you. This is Neighboring 101. This is actually session number 64. And this is where we talk to leaders in the neighboring movement from all across the United States. And we discover ways that our organizations and us as individuals can use the art and skill of neighboring as part of our community and personal development. So thank you for being along in that journey. Just a couple of reminders about what is coming up. Some of our guests next month, which would be April, we'll be hearing from Tim Jones, the founder of Longer Tables, and his presentation on creating places of connection with community table events. And there'll be more information on his program, Longer Tables, leading up to that. And then in March, we're actually going to have two sessions because of schedules. One of those, or I said March, I mean May. May 8th is Building a Stronger Community with a City Membership Campaign. That's Sam Pressler, who I know Pete Davis knows. And then May 15th is a Neighboring Movement and Community Connections. That's with Ian Campbell and Adam Barlow Thomas at the Neighboring Movement in Wichita, Kansas. So good stuff coming up. I know we have a few regulars that are not on today. So that means newbies to the session and others, the pressure's really on you to ask questions in chat or to take off the mic and ask questions as we go. So let me get straight into our introduction. And just want to say what a privilege it is to have Pete Davis joining us today. I know many of you have seen the documentary Join or Die. We've talked about in this class so many times, and we've screened it in Southwest Missouri, I think 9 or 10 times. And it's such a powerful documentary. And just as a personal aside, I want to say this week we had our first meeting of the Retmo Rotary Club in Republic, Missouri, which I started because of the impact of the documentary Join or Die.
That is the best news. That is our absolute favorite response to the film.
Every time I watched it, I thought, oh, I need to do something, right? I need to join something. And there just wasn't much in my town to join. And so we had 18 at our first Rotary Club meeting, and we're excited to get going. Well, again, our guest, Pete Davis, he was an undergraduate at Harvard when he took a class that was taught by Robert Putnam. And many of you know Dr. Putnam, author of Bowling Alone, was really kind of a celebrity among academics. And in the time since, Pete has been advocating for more civic engagement, which is the focus of his work. And in addition to that movie that we've talked about, he has this incredible book that we'll be focusing on, dedicated The Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing. And of course, you know, he and his sister did the movie Join or Die, which was very impactful. Peter is a 2012 graduate of Harvard, and he also completed a law degree at Harvard in 2018. He's the co-founder of Democracy Policy Network. Peter, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
So glad to talk with you all. I've been looking forward to this all week.
I have read the book twice, at least, I believe. And, it's one of those books where I went through it the first time and thought, that's really, really good. And as I thought about it some more, I thought, I think I better reread that. I think I missed some things. So it's a powerful read. I don't know if others on here have read it. We've certainly been promoting it for a while. Can you tell us a little bit about what led to you authoring that book?
Yeah, it was a story of two streams coming together. So on one stream, I had kept getting this advice as a young person. And I talked to all my friends and they had been getting the same advice. And the advice was keep your options open. It was almost like this creed we were repeated over and over again. Keep your options open, keep your options open. Whatever choices you're making, be sure to keep your options open. And that was not leading that, even though we were getting that advice from everyone older than us, we reached a point. I reached a point kind of 10 years into receiving that advice where I was the person in the future that I had kept my options open for. All of my friends were too. And we noticed that it wasn't leading anywhere good. It was not leading to happiness and it was not leading to impact in the world. There are so many of these big public problems. And I was noticing none of the people that were keeping their options open were the ones solving them or feeling kind of joy in their life. Meanwhile, here was the second stream. I was noticing that the people that I was looking up to were what they all had, the people that were making an impact, the people that were killing it at life, the people that were addressing some of the big problems of our time. They were the people who totally ignored that advice. They were people who made a commitment to a particular thing, to a particular community, to a particular institution, to a particular cause, to a particular place. And they showed their love for those things by working at them for a long time. They were who I eventually came to call long haul heroes. And I wanted to kind of explore this tension between this desire in the immediate place to infinitely browse everything in life, keep our options open, and these people who had dug in and rooted themselves somewhere. And here's a funny caveat I'd like to say. I
Mm.
went on a tour for the book and I kept getting these questions that are like, oh, you wrote this book about commitment. You wrote this book about dedication. Do you mean commitment to gym routine, to health regimen, to your New Year's resolution? And I want to clarify, I don't mean that at all. Even though that's very important, you should be committed to those things. But what I specifically mean is people who enter into a relationship with something bigger than themselves, who join up with a culture. People who, I call them local patriots, people who love their place in their neighborhood, stewards of institutions that try to keep them alive and keep institutions alive. I talked to you know, my local rabbi for 30 years. I talked to people who had kept the Bolivian dance culture of Northern Virginia, that's where I'm from, alive by, keeping this tradition going. People who work on a cause for 20, 30, 40 years. I looked at the history. If you look at the history of so many of these amazing moments in American history, we only tell the stories of the big moment when everything changed. And we don't tell the
Mhm.
stories 25 years before where someone was doing day in, day out, week in, week out work that often looked a lot less like a big battle or slaying a dragon and a lot more like attending a Thursday night meeting in a routine way. And so I wanted to have a book that celebrated those types of people and talked about the importance of that.
I, I think you're speaking to the choir on this Zoom. I mean, there are people on here who have been committed to their neighborhood or a neighborhood cause for a long time, and sometimes that can feel pretty lonely.
Totally.
Okay. And I think you saw that. I love the fact that you kind of defined commitment as the act of dedicating oneself to a single pursuit or cause.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's a cause that people are attached to. Were there some favorite examples? Because you kind of give case studies and examples in your book. Is there a favorite one of yours?
Yeah, I ended the book. I'll give it's not a spoiler alert. It's the last story of the book, but it's not like a mystery plot. It's not like giving away the murderer or something. But I put it as the last story of the book because it was my favorite. It's this woman named Karen
Oh.
Washington in the Bronx. Karen Washington had lived as a renter for her whole life, and she finally had enough money and this luck with a program to be able to buy a house in the Bronx. And she buys this house in the Bronx. And then across the street from her house, it turns out, after she moved in and bought it, she finds out there's a vacant lot that is filled with trash, basically. And so she thought she had her American dream. She said, I discovered I had my American nightmare. I finally had this house, but across the street, this vacant lot filled with trash. And what I love about this story is Karen was not the one who decided to clean it up. One of her neighbors, Jose Larios, decided to start cleaning up the trash in the vacant lot. And he says, Karen, will you join me? And I wanted to tell that story because the most important person is often the second person who decides to join up with an effort. And Karen decided to, so that was the first reason I was excited about the story. She decides to join with Jose. They clear out all the trash in the lot. They decide no one's ever going to come solve this from the city. We have to do it ourselves. They clean up all the trash from the lot and they start planting a community garden. And Karen knew nothing about gardening. She starts through this work of planting a community garden. She suddenly learns all about gardening. It suddenly fills up as this garden. Suddenly she gets to know all of her neighbors. Suddenly it becomes one of the major community gardens in the Bronx. Suddenly she, well, hearing from all of her neighbors, she hears about all these other problems going on. And she gets involved in all these different causes around her neighborhood because of what she was hearing. Someone saying, my kid has asthma in the schools and the air quality in the schools isn't good. There's a hunger issue with the food banks. There's this other issue with what's going on in town. Then she gets connected with everyone else who was doing community gardens, and they start this community garden mega organization of all the other community gardens in New York City. Then she eventually becomes kind of known as this organic farm leader of the country, and joins up with other people to buy a farm in Orange, New York, and eventually gets invited to the White House as one of the leading community gardeners in the country. And what I love about the story is this is how leaning into life eventually leads. This is not the exception. This is how everyone who leans into rooting themselves somewhere. It got funny as I was interviewing people for this book. And as we interviewed people for Join or Die, they said, I started just digging in on one thing and then suddenly I was in another thing and another thing. And now I'm mayor of the whole city or something, because it's like an ecosystem, it's like the roots spread out, they become interconnected with other things. There are more complex entities that start forming, and it's all because someone decides to root in and lean into life. And I thought Karen was such a great example of that. And then the other great thing is it takes you for a ride. If you're worried about, you start with a little bit of a routine, you start with a little bit of a commitment, and then it has its own momentum, and you never know where you'll end up, 20 years from now. My mom and grandma have this wonderful phrase that I always like giving as my answer for when people say, why join something or why go out to that Thursday meeting? I always say, they always used to tell me, you know exactly what's going to happen if you stay home tonight. That you're gonna, watch the next episode of Severance or or Yellowstone or whatever, and it's gonna be some whatever slightly enjoyable whatever. You go to sleep, you eat some dinner, whatever. You don't know what's gonna happen when you go out. You don't know who you're gonna meet at that meeting. You don't know what things gonna pop and spark between you. You don't know what's gonna happen when you go out to that Sunday volunteering activity. Newness is gonna come into your life, and almost everyone I talk to, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, almost anyone who kind of leans into community life, they find out it just becomes some great adventure.
Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of grins on people's faces here, but yes, it's a new adventure. I love that. And I feel like maybe this is backing up since I asked you about your favorite story, but you did talk quite a bit in the front of the book, kind of laying the framework, talking about the psychology of choice and this hyper connective, hyper competitive world that we live in, and how that really undermines our ability to focus on things for a long time. Felt like that was sort of that infinite browsing theme that was part of your book. Was that a surprise to you to discover that, or was that something you kind of already
Yeah,
intuitively?
there's this wonderful author. If you want to go deeper on this in another book, there's this wonderful author named Barry Schwartz who wrote a book called The Paradox of Choice. And that gets into the micro psychology of having so many options. So Barry Schwartz looked into this weird mystery, which is almost everything in Econ 101 and in kind of the dominant ideology of the time says more choices equals good. You know, you'd rather have 131 flavors of ice cream instead of two flavors. And yet, when they do psychology studies looking into this, they find out people are more satisfied with their choices when there are less choices. And then he started looking into why that was caused. And he starts
Mm,
figuring out what leads to this surprising result. Well, when you have so many choices and then you pick one and you linger on all of them and then you pick one thing, you start imagining all of the other choices you could have had. So as you're eating your chocolate, you're thinking, I could have had strawberry, I could have had lemon, I could have had vanilla, I could have had all these things. And it puts you in the psychological state of comparison and, assessment. When someone walks in and they say, we're all having chocolate ice cream today. That's the only option. You put your mindset in the state of, well, it's great. We have ice cream. That's wonderful. And you're not, and this isn't, I don't want to be an extremist here. It's really good. We have a lot of choices in society. It's especially good on a justice level of like people have had a lot of choices about the ways they want to live their lives. So many problems 75 years ago where people were in a
mm,
straitjacket of only a few ways you could live. But it's all a balance question. Today, when there's a million
mm,
ways to be, um, I'm not saying we should limit the amount of choices. I'm just saying if you linger in the choice state for so long, it'll eventually burn out your ability to enjoy any of the choices that you eventually choose. So that's why the enemy is not browsing; it's infinite browsing. That my subtitle of the book is "The Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing," and you think you're taking care of your future self by infinitely browsing because you're like, well, I don't want to make a bad choice for my future self. But you wake up as your future self and you'd much rather have had 5 years of digging into something than have had, still be in the hallway of life, having never settled into a place. And so, and then, this is all the negative side of it against browsing. I just want to talk about the positive side. So many things open up to you when you dig into something. So when
mm,
you can walk through a place, and if your mindset is, should I live here or should I not? Should I stay? I know I moved here, but maybe I should leave in 6 months. Do I like this better than something else? You're not going to notice everything that's going on. When you dig in, when you start going to the neighborhood meetings, when you join the civic life, when you befriend the barista and the bartender, when you find out about the old lady across the street and get to know her name and her history a bit more, suddenly the whole place comes alive. It is a living culture that you can join and be a part of that adds meaning and structure to your life. It doesn't just be, there's a real psychological difference between walking through the world and assessing it and walking through the world and celebrating it. Participate, to get highfalutin about this, participating in the liturgy of life. Martin Buber has this amazing book called I and Thou. Has anyone heard of that book, I and Thou?
mm,
I bet this crew would have some people that had heard about that. He talks about you can see the world in terms of I and it. Everything is an it. And he says, when you see everything as an it, as an object, as something you assess as bigger or smaller, better or worse, more lucrative or less lucrative, better opportunity or worse opportunity, it kind of deadens the world. When you see the world as thou, as a fellow you, as a person that you're communing with, as Wendell Berry would call it convocating with. You're having a shared vocation with their story of their life as part of your story of your life. It totally, the whole world comes alive with light. And so part of the message of the book was
oh,
get closer to, let's get to it, to having that experience with everything around us than the experience of, is this the right place to be? Is this the right cause to fight for? Is this the right institution to steward? There are times for
yeah,
that. Browsing is good. Quitting is good. But infinite browse is going to stick you in the I it mode for too long.
yeah. Well, it takes a while for people to get from I live in a neighborhood to saying I live in this is my neighborhood. That
My
sense of
neighborhood,
belonging
yes.
doesn't just happen overnight usually, and it takes time. But you're saying that that's part of that commitment, and in some ways you're saying this commitment can really be kind of a liberating force, even.
Totally. Yeah. It's funny. These, I interviewed 50 who I call long haul heroes for the book dedicated. And what was so amazing about them is I tried to go to extremes to see what was going on. So I like interviewed a nun, a very extreme way of like living your life, lives in a convent, takes holy orders, can't get married, has to follow this vocation and takes up her whole life. And this nun said, because I became a nun, I met all these different types of people. I went all around the world because I met fellow nuns in my order all around the world. Because our order was in charge of running schools, I learned all about education and became this educational leader in Philadelphia. That's known all across the country as this leader, and because her school has been through stuff and she guided them through it. You know, and she said that decision to lock in this corner of my life actually led to my life being a giant adventure. And she said, if I had never become a nun, I would have never had any of that stuff. Maybe she would have made a different commitment and had something different. And, I'm not telling everyone go become a nun or a priest, but that's an extreme version. Think of if that led to so much adventure, how much would just a tiny commitment of, you know, every Thursday night for 3 years, being part of some civic org, that cares about the parks in your town. What will that teach you? And what happens is, I talk about three things that these things bring you. One is it um, gives you this depth of knowledge when you lock into something. So you learn about the external world when you decide to focus on it. Everything that you pass by on the street, you could zoom in on and have 1,000 times as much depth as you're seeking in 1,000 times breadth by ignoring it. So I read this wonderful book in preparing for the book called Seven Walks with Expert Eyes, where someone walks around a block with different experts. And he passed by an
Oh,
expert on font, and he says, on fonts in the city, like the writing. And he said, oh my God, he passes by some letter written on the wall and he goes, oh, this is very interesting. It's a sans serif. It's neo-Gothic. It was big in the city in the 30s and they put up all these sans serif fonts. And, his whole life of excitement inside of that R that he saw painted on the wall. So that's depth externally. Then you get purpose, which is depth internally. You discover a bunch of things about yourself when you lock into a relationship about something. And that's really exciting. Oh, I didn't know I could be a leader. I didn't know that I was actually good at this. I didn't know that I was actually bad at this and I should let other people do that. I didn't know, I went through that really hard thing and I knew I had courage because of that. So that's second. And then third, you get community. All the other people that are locked into that relationship with you, you usually become friends with because you're in it together. And even if you're not friends, you become kind of begrudging nemesis inside of a similar communal world, which also gives you some joy in your life, like seeing the movie Best in Show, about dog shows. All those people, even if they don't get along, they give meaning to each other's lives of something because they decided to enter into this depth of relationship with the world of dog shows. That is, this is so purpose, community, depth, expertise. It's really exciting when you lock into this stuff. I'm sorry for being long-winded. I'd love to hear all of your ideas too.
you're not being long-winded at all. We do want to make time for everybody else to jump in with some questions and things. That's the point of this, of course. So I'm giving you the countdown. This is my last question, and then everybody
Wonderful.
else is on deck. Um, my daughter's a social worker, and she generally watches these videos after the fact with me. So she's not going to want me to use her as an example, but I'm going to just slightly. And she's younger, and I hear her saying at work, especially her generation, this whole follow your passion, which is similar to what you were told and things, but couched a little differently about following her passion. And so even in the midst of a job, she's still kind of eternally, perpetually looking for what is my next step, what is my next passion. And I think we see that in younger hires that kind of jump from job to job a lot. But and you're in a younger generation than I am, so it's very um, uh, what's the right word? It really does my heart good to hear you talking about this topic of going deeper and having a more enduring form of dedication. Is this an idea that you think is resonating with your generation, the younger generation? Is there a shift that's coming?
What I think, I don't want to be a finger wagger with this, telling people like it's bad to do this and therefore you should do this. And I really want to be careful about that. But
Sure.
I do, one of the messages that I did want to say with the film is that let's talk about the phrase discover your passion. Your passion does not come to you usually sitting alone in a all white, as you can see behind me, an all white room, disconnected from anything, and then hoping that the perfect thing that fits your perfect authentic self comes along, and then you declare that's exactly it, and that is what I am, and now I must go
Mm.
seek it out. That's usually not what happens. What happens is that your passion is grown in relationship with something bigger than yourself, in diving into something, all of those parts that makes a commitment exciting, the depth of knowledge that you discover, the purpose that gets lit up in you, the community of other people, those are the things that lock you in. um, they that is the stuff that makes you passionate. So what I often just tell people is, you're not, if you've been in infinite browsing mode for a long time and nothing has stuck yet, it's because you're in infinite browsing mode. It's not because you need to keep searching. Go out into the world, and then it will grow in ourselves. One of best quote I've heard on this is Bob Dylan in the news in the last year with great Timothy Chalamet. Bob Dylan once was asked, "Did you leave Minnesota to go find yourself?" And he's like, "No one finds themselves; they make themselves." And the way you make yourself is you make yourself out of the materials of your commitments and relationships out there in the world. You don't make them
Mm.
kind of sitting in a room. And so with young people, so now on the question of young people, is it resonating? I think young people are discovering that splitting everything into atomistic bits, the shortest TikTok video, the quick trend that's coming out of nowhere, the everyone's into this one day and then into something the next week, does not leave them filled with purpose or community or depth. And they're
Mm.
hungering for purpose and community and depth. We're in a huge social isolation crisis. We're in a meaninglessness crisis. We're in a shallowness crisis. And so we want
Yeah.
community and purpose and depth. And I think you see the heroes of young people remain the long haul heroes. People like LeBron because he's been at it for 21 years, or Serena Williams, or Tom Brady. People like, people were turned on to, I think the reason, not to get political, I think just the reason that among primary challengers within the ideology, the reason Bernie and Trump resonated with people in part is because they had 30 years of being one type of person. you know
Yeah.
Whatever side you're on all of these things, and there's
Yeah.
something about that, and these videos of showing them 30 years ago saying the same thing was really resonant to people. And I think in local lives in our neighborhoods, when people say, who do you look up to in your neighborhood, it's usually the person that's been at it for a long time. And I think people are going to start noticing that the flashiest thing is not it's like candy. It might make you feel good immediately, but it doesn't fill you up like a good, hearty dinner.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, jump in here with some questions, folks. What are your burning questions you have for Pete here before I call out Jennifer or Will or Stan or Chet's not on here this week. He always has a question. Laura's not here. Oh, Jesse, the idea of the short video topics compared to being engulfed in a single topic was super insightful.
Yeah, I
So
appreciate you
just
raising that. It's really funny. If you talk to anyone in media today, they'll say it's really weird. There are uh, two types of media that are taking off. One is these shorter and shorter shock TikTok videos that are like 9 seconds long or whatever, but like dance trends or whatever, memes, things like that. But then on the other side, it's like 3 hour podcasts on Roman history or, you know, uh, 8 week, true crime thing where you're going to learn every single fact about some case. And I think what that is the normal trend we've seen for the last 30 years of shorter and shorter, quicker and quicker, shallower and shallower, meaninglesser
Mm,
and meaninglesser. But then the knee jerk desire to have something totally different that is long term. And I think that's, when people say everything's going bad today, I always am like, let's point to the green shoots. And I think the desire for, long podcasts, long series, people who want, you know, long documentaries on things, people who want to, print magazines and newspapers are actually seeing an uptick now because people want to participate in like an uptick after a long decline because people are starting
hmm
to hunger for participating in the community of a newspaper again. And so, things like Neighboring 101 are taking off now because people are hungering for things like this again. And so I appreciate you raising that point. It's a great
Oh,
example.
that's right. I hope that's right. Oh, Will Cooper. And Will is a fantastic gardener. He could start a community garden in the snap of a finger. It seems like only the choir is listening to the music. I often feel like I need to drag people out of their homes to get them to experience the world in their neighborhood.
I know this is my great vice. This is all easier said than done. I can make this sound like it's the most wonderful thing and it's all happy and we're all going to have a civic rejuvenation. But in the end, you wake up the next day, the fever breaks and no one came to your meeting on Thursday night again. So I know the feeling. My one thing I will say on this is that this is a challenge, community building is a craft. And we all, as a
Mm,
society right
mm,
now, the craft has fallen apart. And so this isn't on any individual person. Craft cultures, the ability to make some specific pot in some region of the world, they can rise and get better and better and better over time. And then they don't pass it on to their kids and don't pass it on to their grandkids. And then we lose the ability to make that pot anymore. It's exactly the same with the culture of joining and community building and civic life. We've had times where everyone was involved in civic life. There were all these different ways of doing Robert's Rules of Order. There were all these different types of parties and types of invitations. Towns used to publish town directories of all the clubs in their town. That's local newspapers of 3,000 towns of 3,000 people had like daily editions, that people paid like 1 cent for, every day. What we found while researching Jordan Dow was amazing. This is all collapsed. And one of the things that's collapsed with it is the best practices of how to get people out of their homes. And so what I think we need to do is we have to just have the sober truth that it has collapsed. We're starting from square one, in the 2020s. We're at a low point. 40% of people belong to no groups. 2/3 of Americans belong to none or only one. Less than half of Americans are in a congregation. Unions are at 6%. There's hardly, most people have never been to a public meeting. We're at a low point. But we what I mean by hone the craft is together we all need to be doing experiments in drawing people out of the community. 9 out of 10 of those experiments will fail,
mm.
but for the one that succeeds, we need to be creating networks of community leaders. That's why I love what you're doing. That's what we're trying to do with the film, where we're passing on best practices to each other, and slowly over time, I think we're going to make it easier and easier and easier to get people out of their homes. And this all has network effects. If you get one person to join the neighborhood group, you go knocking on the door, getting everyone to join, you're the weirdo. You get two people knocking on, people go, what's up with those two people in town? You suddenly get three people knocking on every door. You say, oh, well, I guess this group has a neighborhood organization. And then you get 50% of people knocking on, you say, oh, well, being part of this neighborhood means being in the neighborhood organization. It would be weird to not go, and it's all one step at a time. It's going to be a 50-year project as a country. And we all just gotta get started somewhere. And I honor everyone who's trying it out.
Well, I love your passion for the subject and for how you explained that. I think some of us do feel like the weirdos when we knock alone. So that's a great point. What else do we have here in chat? And guys, you can unmute, of course. Anybody has a question, jump in.
I
Yeah, Jesse's just
go ahead.
Go ahead, jump in, please.
I was just gonna say that I what I'm finding is that as much as we do feel like the weirdos, people appreciate the weirdos, and I'm trying to find that way to get them to like come along to the other side, and be that second person, that third person to make it feel different. But the more I do this kind of stuff on my own and I notice the feedback that you get, it is satisfying in a way to get those messages back that are like, oh, I'm not going to be here, but I really do want to do the next thing or things like that. So it's trying to figure out ways to give people that right level of engagement that can bring them in to the next level of things is tricky, but motivating.
Totally. In so much of our society, when we do things together, like at work or something, it's all organized around the outcome. Like, what's the quickest and fastest and most efficient way to get this thing done? What's interesting about community building is we have to innovate on the production of the work as well, because the most important thing in community is having everyone have an appropriate job to do. The job might be just come to the party. The job might be set up for the party. The job might be help us plan our annual party, things like this, and getting everyone in the right place where it's not too big of a jump and then they are just intimidated, and it's not too small of a jump that they're bored and don't feel like they're making a difference or using all themselves. And so it's a really hard challenge. It's funny. One of my favorite examples of this is in Mormon churches. I'm not Mormon, but I have a lot of Mormon friends. In Mormon churches, there's a joke where it's like you join a local ward and then they immediately say, "Can you mow the lawn?" And like that's their welcoming thing or whatever of the local church. And you go, well, why would that make someone want to join? And it's totally the reverse. It's not, you join and we're throwing something for you and we'll pay you or whatever. Like it's not something you get, it's something you give, because the spirit and joining. And it turns out when that person goes and mows the lawn, they feel closer to the thing, even though they were just burdened by this thing. And so we have to figure that out. It's like, what are the tasks we give everyone? I'm working on a follow-up to Dedicated right now. Is it okay if I share this quick thing? I can share
Yes,
some.
absolutely.
I'm working on the spiritual sequel to Dedicated, provisionally titled Cultivated right now, which is, if Dedicated is about you as an individual deciding to join up with things, this is about how do leaders create the cultures that inspire people to want to join them? How do they cultivate a culture? And so that's why it's called Cultivated. And in kind of researching this and talking with people and reflecting on it, I've found that there's 3 processes that happen. And these are things we can each think about when we're doing cultivation ourselves in a neighborhood, for example. One is, when you create a culture, first is the incremental piecemeal accrual of external practices. So a culture does things. There are things we do. It's, if there's a culture around maintaining the park, you maintain the park, and there's a way you maintain the park. If there's a culture around just getting together and, having community, it's like we throw parties, we throw events, we throw parades. It's your external practices. Then the second thing is the incremental piecemeal accrual of the members' knowledge and affection for those practices. So you as a culture are throwing the parade and throwing the parties and doing the annual street cleanup. But then the second part is you're teaching people to learn how to throw the parties and learn how to throw the parades and do the street cleanup. And I say knowledge and affection because those are tied together. You learn how to do it. You learn how we do it every year, but then you also love doing it every year. And it becomes a thing you look forward to and miss if it wasn't there. And then the third thing is the incremental piecemeal accrual over time of community, relationships with each other among the membership, doing the practices and learning the knowledge. And I just think each of those parts are opportunities to cultivate a culture. So what you got to be thinking about is, what are our practices? What are the things we do as a neighbor? Let's do neighborhoods as an example. What are the things we do as a neighborhood? How can we have more and more of those things, or deeper and deeper, better and better versions of the things? So that has a journey. How can I get more and more people developing knowledge and affection for those things by participating in them? How do I spread out the amount of people that are growing in knowledge and growing in affection of those things? And then finally, how do I have relationships grow between the members of the things? And how do I keep that going over time? All three of those things need to be living things that are always moving forward, or they're dying. Another Dylan line. If you're ain't busy being born, you're busy dying. If you aren't thinking of the next practice, thinking of more people that can come into that practice, thinking of more relationships that can be built between your people, your culture is on the decline. So that's the place to start. I usually I've learned is the way that some of these master cultivators have done it. And I'm sure so many people on this call can share anecdotes about that or edits to that schema.
Well, you've already just sold 2 copies of your new forthcoming book that I know of, and maybe a few others as well. That sounds fascinating. Jennifer, you're off mute. Are you getting ready to ask a question?
Well, I do have a question, but I also just wanted to yes and that because it was just a couple months ago that we were talking to some community kind of organizers, and they were talking about just how exhausting the work is, like, when you're doing all this heavy lifting yourself. And I was ruminating on that just a little bit, and I started looking around my neighborhood, which I am not the main driver of our lovely neighborhood. I am a happy participant and watch how this works. And just about that time, we had had a neighbor shift. So there was 2 neighbors that kind of anchored the cul-de-sac, right? And they were best friends, and one of them moved. And I thought, here's the real test of if this kind of 10 group family unit of neighbors is going to hold, because one of those cornerstones shifted. Had a new family moved in, different culture, different background. And I thought, oh, this is a real test now. And they slipped right in. And I thought to myself, it's because nobody owns this. This is the culture of this cul-de-sac now. This is just what we do. And they moved in, and people just were still sitting in the front on lawn chairs every Friday night. And they're like, I guess this is just what they do in this neighborhood, right? And so I just wanted to yes and you, because I think sometimes we think at a really organizational level, or like neighborhood barbecue level, or like, but this is also just on Friday nights, we sit in the front, and our kids play outside. And when that becomes a culture, nobody's leading it anymore. But I've watched over the past 5 years that trickle effect, just like you said. Now another neighbor has a Friendsgiving, and now another neighbor has a Christmas party that everyone comes to. And now another neighbor has started a running group. And now another neighbor, right? Because now this is just what you do. You just do things together in this neighborhood. It's fascinating. So I am full support of this book, and I think a lot of neighborhood organizers will latch onto it, and maybe we'll give them a little relief. Like, this isn't all on you. If it's all on you, it's going to die as soon as you leave. So this is about culture.
I love it. I love that. That gets to a really great point, which is, when we're in these conversations, my dad was an anthropologist, and anthropologists, they study culture, and it's so funny. Have you ever read like the Wikipedia page for human or the Wikipedia page for American culture? It's very funny. It's like Americans often, eat hamburgers and French fries, and they often eat pizza dough with, tomato sauce and cheese on top of it. That was transferred from Italian immigrants. What culture of it, you can describe it all, you can build these containers, but the eventual success of culture is that it's just inside of you, and it's inside of among you. And it doesn't need to be explicit anymore. And that's when it's most powerful, basically, for good and for ill. I'm not saying there aren't bad cultures out there, or cultures that, need to be disrupted or reformed or things like that. But what is objectively happening is a process by which practices happen, people feel ownership over them, and knowledge and wisdom, knowledge and affection for them, and relationships with each other around them. eventually is the life of life. This is what, if any of you get a chance to watch Join or Die, our film, it's about this guy Robert Putnam. His first study before he studied America was in Italy about making democracy work. And he found out that the most significant thing for a democracy was the presence of a living culture and community. You can write the best constitution, you can have the best economic advisors, you can have the best education system. None of it will work if you don't have the living daily practices of people participating in that. And meanwhile, you can have the worst of all those things. And, in dark times when it feels like a lot of institutions aren't working today, if you have a living culture, it's the thing that will keep you afloat and rejuvenate those institutions and eventually. And, I often say one last thing on that thought is when you say you have a civic organization, what the civic or community organization or community practice or something, that's just the scaffolding. What really is doing the work is not that you have Thursday meetings and you have a president, vice president, and treasurer. It's almost like that gets structured up here that gives a container to the social network of real people doing something, and so I often say the organizations where everyone's just friends with each other, and even if they burned all their files, and didn't know who was president, vice president, treasurer, secretary anymore, if the org has been working for a long time, they're in a dense social network where the culture has come inside them and among them, and they'll be able to just keep doing it. And so don't get too rigid on the scaffolding. Don't confuse the scaffolding of this for the actual thing itself. So I love that point.
Yeah. Other questions? In fact, there's a few here in chat. Jesse, last year we had 5 neighborhood-wide events organized outside the neighborhood association. The organizers simply just asked if they could use our communication channels. So yeah, you've got a good thing going and letting people know what is going on. That's a key part of it, isn't it?
Love that.
And
love the idea that when you have a healthy org, there's all these extracurricular events happening all the time. That's when it's thriving. That's a lot of people feeling ownership over this.
For sure. Thanks.
And Amy, I think I may have skipped over Amy, since oftentimes is an issue for those who want to do more in their community, was wondering about your thoughts on year-long volunteer programs that provide stipends. Would having more of those programs or possibly a revision help?
I sound like I'm copping out on this and not giving a straight answer, but it's really what I believe, which is in terms of how you organize something, it's always an experimental question. And I just encourage experimentation. I don't think there are any hard and fast rules on these things. Some orgs need dues, and the Rotary Club and the Kiwanis Club and unions and political parties, they have dues. 12-step programs are some of the most successful, impactful, or Bill W's probably like one of the most successful civic entrepreneurs in American history. They have no money, that's exchanged, and they don't even have membership roles, like things like that. Then there are others that have really rigid membership roles and, really exclusive things, and they're constantly publicizing and money. And so in the way money flows in an org, I would just encourage experimentation and be open to a bunch of different things. Like maybe you need to pay an annual staff. Maybe you have enough to have dues and then money comes in and then you're able to pay a staffer whose full-time job is being the leader of this because that's what's needed to get it off the ground. But other groups, because they have a staffer, that staffer thought they should do everything, and then no one feels a sense of ownership anymore. They stop doing things because they say the staffer's the one who should do it. You introduce a little bit of money and they say, well, if I'm not going to get paid, I'm not going to do it. And you lose the miracle of like other incentives and motivations because of the little bit of money, and it doesn't work. So it could go in either direction. I would just encourage people to try things out, cut loose things that aren't working quickly, and double down on things that are working, and so that's an interesting model. And that's a question, this guy, Seth Godin, who's this great kind of marketing guru, he actually had a phrase that I thought was useful for civics, where he said, money is a story. which is, you know, the money that flows through your org is part of your org story, and don't think about it as a lamentable thing. Think about it as another part of civic life. Part of civic life is we give money. Part of civic life is we give time. Part of civic life is we give ideas. Part of civic life is we have fights with people. Part of civic life is we heal those fights. You know, all of this is part of civic life. And so don't have the money part be outside of it. Think about your mission. Think about, you know, get everyone on the same page, have everyone be in leadership in this, have everyone feel co-ownership over the money story, you know, because that's going to be a thing that's going to lead to the money being used well and the money being given well. So,
Yeah. Well, maybe one final question here, Janice, is, and this kind of jumps back to join or die. Janice says, you mentioned that a living culture and community can rejuvenate failed institutions. I was wondering about Putnam's study of different regions in Italy. Do you know if regions with many social groups like choirs always had uh, always had them, and especially how they did under fascism?
yeah, I'll give a really quick story for people who don't know this study. Yeah, no, it was in the 90s. It was done from the 70s through the 90s. It was a 20-year study. Italy decentralized its government in the mid 70s. And it used to have a really strong centralized government. Mussolini, strong centralized government, you know, still had one after he was gone, and they eventually split into regions. It was like as if the US never had states and suddenly they had states. And those states all had the same constitution or something. You know, Italy always had regions, but they suddenly all had a government that was structured in the exact same way. And Putnam goes, this is an incredible experiment because I can follow each of these regional governments. They're all starting at the same starting line, and I can see which ones work and which ones don't. And most importantly, I can find out why some work and some don't. So he's eventually does 20 years of finding out which ones are the best, which are the worst. Emilio Romagna is the best. Everyone's satisfied. It gets done what it says it'll get done. It's a stable government, even though there's different parties and democracy. Everyone's kind of feels like the system is working. Down here's Calabria and Basilicata. No one's satisfied. Mafia's run over it. No education, bad crime. You know, people aren't satisfied with the government. It doesn't work. Then, most importantly, he tries to find out what makes Emilia Romagna different than Basilicata, and on down the line in the spectrum of 20 regional governments. He finds out it's not the economy, it's not education, it's not the structure of government, it's not rural versus urban divide. What it is it's the amount of bocce clubs and choirs and football teams and local newspapers and conversations on the street and neighbors that know each other. It is civic life and community life that is what leads to functional government. And so what I mean by institutions are rejuvenated by community is that when you surround what an institution is, just us baking in some ideal of a community or some process into some regimented routine. Like, instead of us randomly ad hoc, you know, sending mail to each other, we're going to bake in a post office. We're going to have a structure for this post office. It's going to have a bank account. You know, it's going to do things. It's going to follow rules. Same with a court system or a hospital or a school or a government. You know, it's a baked in institution. The thing is, when you think those institutions are just going to run on their own, well, you know, we'll pay in our tax dollars and, you know, they have staff and they do it and we're not going to really pay attention, they usually fall apart. When they're surrounded by a community, and so they still have staff and they have processes and rules and whatever, but we're also all checking in on it. We're having discussions about it. We know a bunch of people in it. You know, there's citizen advisory boards for all the institutions. There's high participation. Everyone's reading local newspaper articles about the post office and the hospital and the school and the government. It functions a lot better. And so, and you can't even, that's to just keep an institution that already exists functioning. To start an institution, it usually starts as an informal community. You know, we're all together. We think it would be good if we had a police force or a high school or, you know, a government or whatever. Usually that thick trust and community spirit is what eventually allows you to establish one of these. Now, okay, on the question of how did it do during fascism, the origin of fascism in Italy. civic life has a really interesting relationship with authoritarianism. There's different theories on it. Some theories say that the presence of civic life, and I believe this, the presence of civic life is a bulwark against authoritarianism, where when you have a really thick horizontal civic life, there's a lot of clubs and organizations and community, it's harder for an authoritarian, tyrannical, fascist government to prey on people, because you're already getting your meaning and you're already having a functional society. Usually authoritarians take it over when everyone's alone, isolated, seeking meaning, and things aren't functioning. So there are others, though, and I just want to give the other side, that say the presence of civic life sometimes can be taken over by fascist orgs, and you have a Boy Scouts and then suddenly you have a Hitler Youth or something, and it can sometimes prepare people for these things. But usually, in most cases, what we see is the fascists want to clear out civic life because it's a thing that stands in the way of up top relationship with everyone isolated. And so I'm kind of the mind, you can kind of read different articles on this, but I'm of the mind that civic life is a antidote and inoculation against fascist takeover and is a bulwark against it when it has taken over.
And we all have that within our own capacity, right? To be a cog, to be a part of that. I mentioned at the beginning, starting Rotary Club in Republic, Missouri. We were screening your movie at the local library. And in preparation for that, I thought, I'm going to research the clubs that are in my town. And at the end of this screening, I'm going to have these clipboards and say, if you want more information on this club, we're just going to, before they go out the door, we're going to, make your commitment here, sign up. And in the researching of my club, I found that this growing city in Missouri, 25,000 population, had 3 clubs, and none of them were very functional in certain terms of membership or involvement. They were all struggling in a town with 25,000 population. So that's what motivated me to do a Rotary Club. But at the same time, we've been doing things in a neighborhood, and that neighborhood can really be one of those civic clubs as well. And so I think most of the people on this call have that potential to grow their neighborhood and grow the social capital right there. And there is fantastic results that come from that. But sometimes
Amen.
we need the reminder, like you've given us today, that this is for the long haul. Be dedicated and stick with it.
Well, I appreciate that. It is one of the most inspiring stories I've heard on our whole tour with the film that you started that. And as you can all tell, I'm just a windbag talker. So the real work is after this stuff, which is all the work you're doing in your neighborhoods. And so I am just in awe of all of you who are people who spend midday on a Thursday during your lunch hour thinking about the future of neighborhoods. It is like, that is like the hero of the book. That is the hero of the movie. And I'm just so in awe. It gives me hope that there are 16 people on this call wanting to think about the future of their neighborhood. So, and David, especially the story of doing a civic census, which is something we recommend people do a civic census of your town, and then notice where there's gaps and start to fill them. And that's exactly what you're doing.
Well, thank you for being on here, man. It's been fantastic to meet you in person by Zoom, and we really appreciate your involvement. We had to throw in a different day of the week because of spring break for this, and so our live numbers are down a little bit, but the video usually gets watched, several hundred times, and there's over 900 people in this network actually that get notices of it,
Amazing.
know about the book, and all part of this growing neighboring movement across the nation.
You're talking to the
be
wrong guy
encouraged.
if you think 16 if you think 16 people meeting is not a big deal, because I think 16 people meeting is the start of something really special. We were just at the National Farmers Union. We looked up the history of it. It was 8 families that met and started the National Farmers Union. Now it's a giant national organization. So many stories just start with 15 people in a room, and to hear that you have hundreds on this network is amazing. So I'm so honored to be part of this, and so great talking to y'all. Please be in touch, everyone. We're at joinorddiefilm.com if you want to host a screening.
We needed that reminder. All right. I'll end the record and thank you very much for being with us.
Have a good one.